The House Energy and Commerce Committee spent the full day grilling the CEO of TikTok, America's most popular social media app for teenagers, with roughly 150 million Americans choosing to use that platform. For more than 6 hours at Capitol Hill today, lawmakers in both parties lambasted Xu Zichu in what the Washington Post called, and we would agree, having watched it all, quote, an unusually hostile and unified coalition of lawmakers. Contrary to common perception, TikTok's 40-year-old CEO is not Chinese. He instead is Singaporean, born and raised in Singapore to working-class parents. While still a teenager, he left Singapore and spent the next 15 years in the West, first moving to England, where he received an economics degree, and then worked for Goldman Sachs in London, and then he moved to the U.S. to obtain a degree from Harvard Business School, and then interned at what was then a U.S. startup called Facebook. He then spent a decade working in a venture capital firm in Hong Kong and is married to a Taiwanese-American woman. But he is not, as many believe, a citizen of China, nor has he ever been. Instead, the concern that has prompted the Biden administration to demand that TikTok either sell itself to an American company or be banned from operating in the United States is not so much about the CEO personally. Instead, it's fears that TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is clandestinely controlled by the Chinese government, which, according to this line of reasoning, allows the Chinese government to weaponize TikTok to disseminate disinformation and propaganda to Americans, as well as to collect ample data about the 150 million Americans choosing to use the platform. In other words, an opportunity to spy upon American citizens on behalf of China. That's the dual concern about TikTok, is they're feeding harmful content to American citizens, as well as serving to spy on Americans on behalf of the CCP. The main response of TikTok, as articulated by its CEO, is that it has already offered and is currently offering to provide more transparency about its source code and its internal operations than any other big tech company to date has thus far agreed. The CEO touted in particular what the company calls Project Texas, a way to ensure that all of the relevant data and source code that is collected by TikTok will be stored not in Singapore or in China, where TikTok says it has no operations, but instead in the United States, specifically at the Austin, Texas headquarters of Oracle, the American company that has a stake in TikTok. In other words, they're saying, we will open our source code to an American company, to outside sources. We will let you see everything that we're doing, so you know that China has no opportunity to invade the data privacy of our users, namely American citizens. To illustrate how bipartisan the cynicism and anger was, that assurance, which he offered in his 5-minute open statement, prompted Congressman Frank Pallone Jr., a Democrat of New Jersey, the ranking member of this committee, to respond, quote, I don't believe you. I still believe that the Beijing Communist government will still control and influence what you do. Now, there's all kinds of, I think, important considerations to contemplate here, because again, whatever else is true, however much antipathy you feel toward China, however much distrust you have of TikTok, to have the United States simply ban, prohibit a social media app that tens of millions of Americans are using to communicate with one another and with the world is an extraordinary power for the United States to claim. The Biden administration says it wants to do it, although it's saying it doesn't believe it has the ability to do so unilaterally, likely because it doesn't want to alienate millions and millions of young Americans and teenagers who forever will blame the Democratic Party for banning their favorite social media app, and therefore are saying an act of Congress is needed in order to get Republican buy-in so that both parties are to blame. One of the major aspects of how the Chinese-U.S. relationship needs to be considered is that ordinarily when the United States has an enemy, it wants to isolate or demonize or destabilize or go to war with, whether it be Cuba or Venezuela or Iran or Russia. It's able easily to unite all relevant centers of power to convince them they have no real economic stake in any of these countries and therefore can succeed and thrive even though sanctions will be imposed on those countries and those countries will be isolated. There's generally unity when it comes to U.S. foreign policy among all American centers of power. That is absolutely the opposite of the truth when it comes to China. You have the U.S. security state that increasingly regards China as a grave threat to American interests, and yet Wall Street is so in bed with China that it's impossible to imagine almost how they could ever be extricated. And so when, for example, the Biden administration is threatening to ban TikTok or to force TikTok to sell itself to an American company, Beijing already today said, if you do that, essentially we will do the same to you. Imagine, for example, if China tells the numerous American companies operating in China, Apple or Nike or Tesla, that you are no longer allowed to operate on our soil. And in fact, because of this precedent that was just set, we demand if you want to stay here that you first sell yourself to Chinese business interests. So that's always a problem when it comes to the United States, is the leverage it has over China is extremely limited because of the interdependency the two countries have economically, and in particular the need for Wall Street and major corporate America to use China for cheap labor and for its factories, and for, in general, it's dependent on the Chinese supply chain. In other words, it has widespread repercussions far beyond what normally would be the case when the United States wants to take action against a new enemy. Now, there are a couple things to note here. One is the irony that for a long time, the United States' current view of TikTok is how China viewed American tech platforms. Namely that we don't trust Google and Facebook to operate in China. We believe they're going to disseminate disinformation or destabilize our country if we allow them to simply freely operate within our country. And for many years, China, as well as Iran and Russia and others, placed severe limits on what companies like Google and Facebook or Twitter could do within their countries, citing the same kinds of national security concerns the Biden administration is currently citing as reasons to need to limit or ban TikTok. And in fact, the West's view was that that proved the despotism of China, that China was afraid to allow U.S. social media platforms to operate further within it. So here we have, for example, the Council on Foreign Relations and its February 17, 2017 report. There you see the title, China's Central Government has cracked down on press freedom as the country expands its international influence. But in the internet age, many of its citizens hunger for a free flow of information. And the report reads, listen to this to see the parallels, quote, U.S. technology in China. In more recent years, China has made it exceedingly difficult for foreign technology firms to compete within the country. The websites of U.S. social media outlets like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram are blocked. Google, after a protracted battle with Chinese authorities over the banning of search terms, quietly gave up its fight in early 2013 by turning off a notification that alerted Chinese users of potential censorship. In late 2014, China banned Google's email service, Gmail, a move that triggered a concerned response from the U.S. State Department. In January 2015, China issued new cybersecurity regulations that would force technology firms to submit source code, undergo rigorous inspections, and adopt Chinese encryption algorithms. The move triggered an outcry from European and U.S. companies who lobbied governmental authorities for urgent aid in reversing the implementation of new regulations. CFR senior fellow Adam Siegel writes that, quote, the fact that the regulations come from the central leading group and that they seem to reflect an ideologically driven effort to control cyberspace at all levels makes it less likely that Beijing will back down. Now, again, maybe you're somebody who believes that you want TikTok out of the United States. You don't think any firms, even adjacent to the Chinese, and again, the argument of TikTok is we are not a Chinese company. We are based in Singapore and the United States. Our board of directors has a majority of Americans on it. The prior CEO was American. We have Americans all up and down the leadership structure. And even with regard to this parent company, there's dispute. They dispute, I don't think that credibly, that there's a close relationship to China. It is worth noting that China, Iran, Russia, and other countries have had similar concerns about American social media companies operating in their countries. They're feeding our youth disinformation. They're destabilizing our country with the kind of content that they're feeding. And yet those countries' desires to ban or control or limit American tech companies was viewed as despotic, an effort to stifle the free flow of information within those countries. So it's worth asking whether or not there are similar concerns that are raised by the Biden administration's desire to ban what is arguably the one major social media company not fully under control of the U.S. security state. Remember, the whole point of the Twitter files was that the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security have designs on controlling big tech. They want to ensure that decisions about what content you can and can't see, about what viewpoints you can and cannot voice, are subject to the control of the United States government. And that's why it's so important to them to maintain the monopoly power of Facebook and Google, because U.S. security officials have said that monopoly power that big tech wields is important to our national security objectives because we control the content of those monopolies. And we want them to remain powerful because they do our bidding. TikTok is arguably the one company that Americans can use not subject to those controls. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.